Welcome to one of the Monash Energy Institute webinar series. This is perhaps the second or third of the international webinars, maybe the fourth. And the first one I'm honored to host as the new director of the Monash Energy Institute. My name is Ariel Liebman. And together with the new deputy director of the Monash Energy Institute, 𝗗𝗲𝗿, we have inherited a fantastic institute from the previous leadership and Professor 𝗗𝘁𝗁𝗁𝗍𝗂𝗍𝗁 and the team there. I've been involved in both. I will introduce our esteemed speaker in a minute, but I'll just sort of introduce the institute a little bit more. And the institute is a collaborative effort within the Monash University. It is been around for about 5 years and has grown in leaps and bounds. We are now a cooperative investment from 3 faculties and Monash Central Administration. The 3 faculties are engineering, business and economics, and Faculty of Information Technology, as well as Central with partnership from the Monash Buildings and Properties Division, who is sponsors and managers of our world-leading net zero and microgrid initiatives. So Monash is the largest university in Australia, for those of you who don't know, in terms of student numbers. We've been around for about 55 years. Our university itself was named after Sir John Monash, who was the founding chairman of the State Electricity Commission of Victoria, who transformed the Victorian energy system from a distributed energy system with local coal-burning power plants into a centralized system. So he modernized it. So we're very honored and very well suited to sort of carrying on his mission, hopefully. And so the Institute itself brings together great minds from across the Monash researcher ecosystem and in many disciplines. So we're cross-disciplinary, and we're cross-faculty, and we focus on moving the dial, moving the needle, whichever is the right expression in whichever continent. And through that, we work with industry and government to actually create real impact. We've been very successful in this in the last 5 years, we believe. We've developed some major industry partnerships, such as and major initiatives. We've got the Monash Net Zero and Microgrid Initiative, where we are the first Australian university to lead into a net zero by 2030, and we've received a UN award for that. We have other major industry initiatives around the Reliable, Affordable, Clean Energy for 2030 Cooperative Research Centre, where we're leading the Networks program. And a recent major partnership with Woodside Energy, which is going to focus on transitioning to a green hydrogen economy using our range of engineering, IT, economics, and behavioral science specialists who will underpin that program. So I would like to also do my acknowledgement of country now. I wish to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nation on whose lands we are gathered here today, and I pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. There is more information on the lands of the Kulin Nation on the Monash website if you're interested, and we will share a link within the webinar. So more webinars will come. You can find them on our webinar webinar page. This webinar is recorded, so please keep that in mind. If you're uncomfortable with that, that's okay. We like to record and share our webinars for future reference, and they'll be available within a couple of weeks or so, or maybe sooner, on our website. This will be a 1-hour webinar, although we are going to try, Lawrence and myself, to leave a lot of room for Q&A and discussion. It's a tricky thing in this COVID world to have a vibrant webinar where you have interactive discussion, and we're still finessing that, trying to work out how to do that better. So we will be trying a few new things maybe here today. And so I'd like to then encourage everybody during the Q&A to use the Q&A window rather than the chat window, but chat is okay. So now I'm honored to finally welcome our speaker from the United States, Dr. Lawrence Jones. And Dr. Jones is an award-winning leader and practitioner and Vice President of International Programs at the Edison Electric Institute, an honorary industry fellow at the Monash Energy Institute. Lawrence is a long-standing friend of the Institute, and he serves also on our Industry Advisory Council alongside other Australian and international energy leaders. So he is particularly focusing at the moment in this discussion and some of his deliberations on the interaction between COVID-19 and the energy transition. There's a question: is it going to help? Is it going to hinder? How will the world's energy systems look like post COVID-19? And one of the things that we are developing area of work in the Institute is around energy justice and just transitions, and what this means for both developing economies and also, this, I guess, in the end will be some new jobs required for the legacy technologies. So without any further ado, I'd like to ask Lawrence Jones to start his presentation. He'll be speaking for maybe 20-25 minutes, I think, and then we'll open for Q&A, and we're going to try some kind of a fireside chat method for that, where he and I will be taking questions from the audience, and he'll be answering them, and perhaps we can even invite one or two audience members to join and verbally and ask a few questions if the format permits. It's still experimental, so we will see how it goes. So please help me welcome Dr. Lawrence Jones.
Thank you so much, Ariel, and thank you so much, 𝗗𝘁𝗲𝗍 and Nancy and everyone at Monash. It's really a pleasure to be speaking with you this evening or this morning for your time. So I must say that it's less than 6 months ago, I was actually in Melbourne, and I had a very interesting conversation with Ariel, 𝗗𝘁𝗲, and at the time Jack, about a whole range of topics. And we were debating this whole issue of the impact of COVID-19 on energy systems. Little did we know that the scale and scope of at the time what we thought was a localized epidemic was going to mushroom to where now today we have across the globe about 20 million infected citizens, and also several 100,000 of our fellow humans have died due to this virus. And as I reflect, my last trip to Australia, which was then from Melbourne, I flew over to Sydney, and I was fortunate there to spend a day there. And I recall going to an Indian restaurant on the Circular Quay around 12 o'clock for lunch, and I was the only guest in that restaurant. And I remember the owner saying to me that I'm so pleased to have you here, because it is obviously you're obviously my first guest, and I got a sort of an eerie feeling that something was afoot as I left Australia and flew back to the States through San Francisco. And fast forward to today, I'm currently in a hotel room in Boston, where I was visiting with my family, and I'm normally based in Washington, D.C., but I was able to come up for some other family reasons. But needless to say, what I find very interesting is that the world I left in Australia is not the world we have today. And so when I was asked by Ariel and others to do this webinar and figure what do I want to talk about, it became clear to me that as I think about the global energy transition in terms of what is happening across the globe, it's safe to say that it has to be put in a context of COVID. In fact, I would argue that as we look forward, anything we're discussing across the globe today has to be put in the context of COVID, because this pandemic has really upended the world, and everything is being touched, everything is being changed. And so when I thought about the title for my talk today, Rethinking the global energy transition pathways in the context of what happens after COVID, I was struck to realize that it is not so much the issue of what COVID is going to do directly to the energy systems of the world, but it's more so thinking about what it does in terms of giving us a new lens to which we need to start thinking about everything we do across the globe. And you know, some of the questions that I've been struggling with the last couple of months sort of involve things like, you know, how does one even start to think about an energy transition in the midst of a pandemic where you have so many people dying? Or how do you think about the global risk that are emerging, both before COVID, but even after COVID? And what do we do with things like trust deficit in society? What do we do with things like the lag in technology adoption, or how we view the world in terms of what customers want or what customers would like to have in a post-COVID-19 world? What kind of research we need to do, or even you know, what kind of innovation we think would be relevant. And then if you put this in the broader energy context and think about the notion of universal access to energy by 2030, which was a goal set by the United Nations, you can ask yourself the question, are any of those goals even achievable now in the context of COVID? Or, as we'll see in some parts of my presentation, one can ask the question, will this accelerate the evolution of this energy transition because of COVID? And these are questions I've been struggling with thinking about over the last couple of months as this pandemic takes hold across the globe. I don't want to say too much. Again, I work for the Edison Electric Institute in addition to being affiliated with Monash University. And that is something I take very seriously in terms of you know, the work we do at EEI. We're an association representing investor-owned utilities. I run the international program, and we have members spread across the globe in about 90 countries, including Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and other parts of Southeast Asia. So let me just start by making one important point, that the reason why I titled my talk Rethinking is because we really at a point where we have to question all of our old assumptions about not just energy systems, but about everything we've done in the past. I mean, COVID is really forcing us to rethink and reimagine the world after this pandemic is gone. And obviously there is inertia in every system, and the human system is not one that is any different. And so there is going to be a strong resistance to change irrespective of the impact that COVID is having, and the fact that we see that change has to be something we focus on. So new thinking is going to be critical going forward. And in the context of this global energy transition, when you search the literature, you realize that the word transition has multiple meanings. And currently, as we think of the energy system and the energy transition, there are so many different pathways being explored by different countries, by different regions. I typically use the phrase that the energy transition is global in scale, it's global in scope, but it's local in content and local in character. And I will talk a little bit about that in the context of this presentation, because we have to fundamentally understand the local aspects of energy systems, but we have to also do it in a broader global context. And so questioning, which is something I'm also spending a significant amount of my time now. When you're in lockdown in your room or in your house, you start to ask yourselves a lot of hard questions. And that's one of the things I've been doing in preparing for this presentation, thinking about what are some of the questions we really need to be asking ourselves in the context of thinking differently about pathways towards global energy systems. And so a lot of this discussion tonight will be about questions that we should be asking ourselves. And I know this is kind of different because most people come to these kind of webinars and expecting I'll call it a quantitative download of information that they can take and go and run around with. But because we're talking about the world post-COVID-19, it's very different to dump on you a lot of information, which may be totally invalid in the next couple of months. So I thought, instead of giving you a barrage of data, most of which may not have any meaning in the next 7, 8, 9 months, I thought, why don't we spend this hour really thinking about the questions we should be asking, bringing up some provocation in terms of our own thinking, so that when we're done, each of us can leave from here a little bit inspired to think about asking ourselves some of the questions to give us food for thought as we move forward. So, you know, one of the authors I really admire for his work is 𝗗𝘁𝗁𝗁 at Harvard, and at MIT. He talks about, you know, that the bigger the problem we have in the world, the bigger the insight we have, and the bigger the questions we should be prepared to ask. And so COVID-19 is, in fact, a big problem, but the energy transition is even a bigger problem if you look in the long-term horizon in terms of how we deal with it, the energy systems of the world. So asking the hard questions is critical in the context of thinking about how we rethink energy systems and the transition in front of us. But then it also is important for us to think of the value of facts. We're living in a world today where you know, facts can be interpreted differently by different people, which sounds kind of funny because my fact, even though I know it's not necessarily accurate, I may see it as fact from my perspective. And so the world right now is struggling from having what I would call a collective understanding of what is fact or what is fiction. And that is important in the context of an energy transition, because if we do not agree on what is indeed fact, it's going to be difficult for us to chart a course to move forward. So thinking about, you know, the present, but keeping in mind that where we are is a function of where we came from, and where we're going will be a function of what we do today. And facts have to drive those decisions. Now, one of the challenges we have in the world today is that facts can be interpreted based on the lens with which you view that fact. And we will certainly have that point we can discuss going forward. In the context of COVID, I just put a few slides here that kind of give you an idea on where we see major countries around the world, the trend lines in terms of how COVID is evolving. We know in Australia, you have a surge in some parts of the country. In the United States, we have surge in many parts of the country for all kinds of reasons. In India, we've seen things happening in Brazil, in other parts of the world. New Zealand is a place to watch in terms of them being able to deal with COVID. And so even in terms of just COVID-19 itself in the pandemic, you see that again, is a global thing, but it has so many different approaches to how we deal with it on a local lens. And that we see here will be something we'll come back to. Globally, in terms of COVID-19, this chart just talks about the fact that whether you're in the EU, in the US, even the African Union, South Korea, different countries are taking different approaches to how they recover from COVID from an economic standpoint. Now, what happens after COVID? And this is key as we move into this whole discussion around what happens to the energy transition post-COVID-19. And so the question we need to ask is what the world is going to look like post-COVID-19. And I've laid out here a couple of ideas in terms of what one may want to consider to be the emerging new normal. Again, this is not cast in stone. I'm very open to ideas to throw everything away or modify it. But just to give you some food for thought, we have to accept the fact that we're going to be living with a pandemic mindset. Keep that in mind as we talk about the energy transition, living with a pandemic mindset. What does that mean? We need to rethink all of our assumptions as we look at energy systems. We know energy systems have evolved around certain economic theories. Well, will those theories still stand if some of the fundamentals of consumer behavior and social norms change? So we need to question that. How we engage with stakeholders, that comes back to this issue of fact and truth. Efficiency, productivity. Most people have been working from home, or many people have been working from home. And in some countries, they see it as an inefficiency gain. And so the question is working from home going to be the new normal? And by the way, what does it mean if you work from home in terms of the indirect impact it may have on the economies of cities that depend on people working in urban communities, right? Globalization. Am I ever going to visit Australia again? I hope so, but I'm not sure because will I want to wear a mask for 16 hours on a flight to get to Melbourne? I'm not sure I want to do that. And if I don't, well, what does it mean for the tourism industry? What does it mean for travel? Supply chain, are things going to be locally produced, or will I start to produce everything? Will things be still globally produced, or will I have to revisit my supply chain and start doing some local manufacturing? What does it do to trade, international trade? Performance metrics, how do I measure productivity? What do I measure in terms of the grid? Is the grid reliable? Well, can I talk about reliability without looking at cybersecurity? What does that mean? How do I create value in society? If people don't want to travel, how do I give them that personal experience of being, say, visiting Australia, going to a scenic site if I can't go there physically? Is the world going to go more virtual? And will people find that virtual experience just as rewarding as they found the physical experience, right? So that brings us to virtual reality and what I call the new reality. And what happens if we have second wave or third waves and other forms of disasters that will disrupt society? So as we think of the energy transition going forward, in any country, in any context, we need to think about this issue of what's the new normal and how will COVID shape the new normal that will affect us. Now, this is a chart I've used many times, and it shows the world at night. And it shows basically parts of the world that have more access to electricity compared to other parts of the world. What is interesting, if you see here, is that, in fact, if you did a correlation between parts of the world that are densely populated in terms of access to electricity, you see a little correlation where many of the developed countries are the ones who are having significant impacts when it comes to COVID. So it's almost like you could overlay this map with a COVID map, and it will probably tell a picture of where you have high amounts of COVID in high urban communities where you have high access to electricity and other kinds of development gains, whereas in many developing countries, you probably have a different story. But again, the issue here is this chart talks about energy systems around the world. And the question is, how do you close the gap? How do you transition the global energy system so that you can keep the entire world lit up, but don't affect the climate? Because that's the fundamental driver for a lot of these changes with regards to energy transition, is getting the world to be more low carbon intensive. And that would mean, how do we provide ourselves electricity or provide energy use in other sources? So for me, I think, wherever you are in the world, there are multiple pathways towards the global energy transition. And I'm certainly open to conversations around which pathway is most effective. What I think is important is that each pathway you choose is dependent on the local conditions. And so obviously the pathway chosen by the EU will be fundamentally different from that of the US or China. In some cases, you may have, say, China, where you may have China being a leading player in terms of renewables. They could be lagging when it comes to the reduction in coal, for example. Or you have the Middle East, where you have North Africa, significant oil reserves, but now they're moving to renewables. Or you have the situation you have in Australia or even in New Zealand. So globally, there are so many different pathways. And now, so what ties all of these pathways together? And what do I think is very important for us to take out of the context of COVID? And as we look at pathways across the world, how do we rethink them? And what's the strategy I think we should use to rethink these transition pathways for the energy system? And so obviously, flow of energy in terms of supply, you have fuel sources being shipped from one part of the world, oil being shipped across the globe, natural gas being shipped. What is interesting, one resource or one set of resources that is not easily shipped are the renewables, because guess what? In most cases, they're localized. And so from an energy transition standpoint, where we've had massive flows of supply fuel sources across the globe to energize the world, as we look at the energy transition, these massive flows of energy across the globe may not necessarily be what we have in the next 20, 30 years, because most renewable energy sources are actually locally produced. And so how is this chart going to look like? And what are the implications if you start using more renewables and have less importation of other fuel sources from across the globe? Now, as I think of this issue as it relates to COVID-19, the world after COVID, one thing I find fascinating is that we're in a time where there's massive flows of all kinds of things that are interconnected, right? I've only given you an example of 5 here that I think are critical. The energy transition pathways are tied to the flow of 4 other important things we see happening. Technology and innovation or ideas are flowing across the globe, and information is flowing across the globe. Health, as COVID-19 has shown us, is not localized. So viruses spread rapidly across the globe. And finance and commerce. And so as we think of energy transition pathways, we have to think of what do these other flows mean for the transition of our energy system? Because we cannot just say, let's just transition the energy system without thinking about the interactions and the implications as it relates to these other flows that we have. And I think it's extremely important for us to think about these flows going forward. One of the things I think is important is, yes, we can come back and talk about technology, because a lot of the times when you talk about the energy system, energy transition, we, for right reasons, talk a lot about the supply side, or we talk about the technology side. And so if you think of technology, for example, everything from energy storage, advanced nuclear fission or even fusion, CCUS, advanced renewables, meaning advanced geothermal or even offshore wind, zero carbon fuels like hydrogen, which is big in Australia. All of these things are very important. But I would argue that in terms of understanding the complexity that comes with this picture that shows all of these interrelated flows, it is not enough to just think of the transition from the standpoint of technology and the transition from the standpoint of innovation. We have to start thinking about some of the broader issues that will make this energy transition or design these pathways in a way that makes sense. And in that context, I talk about a few things here. Ariel mentioned the issue of making sure that the energy transition is just and equitable. I think it's important to understand that wherever you are, at the end of the day, energy systems are meant to provide, improve the livelihoods of citizens in that country. And so discussing energy transition without thinking about how do you make it just and equitable, especially as we now see the coupling between energy and health as it relates to COVID, where in many countries in the world, the poorer communities are the ones that are bearing the brunt of the impact of COVID-19 for all kinds of reasons. So health and energy systems are key. So when you think of the just transition, it's not just providing affordable energy to citizens of the country, it's also making sure that the energy that's provided enable the health systems to work in a way that is beneficial for the citizens of those countries. The other thing that is interesting as I look at these 5 sets of flows, if you may, that are interconnected and tied to the energy transition pathways of wherever you are, whether it be at Australia, New Zealand, these are all linked, is what I call the governance of the energy transition, whether it's the governance in your country or the governance on a global scale. And what do I mean by that? We understand that after the Paris Agreement, there was a lot of discussions around where the world was going to go in response to that. And we saw what happened. Many countries, even after Paris was put in place, decided to either go their own course. They all created their NDCs in terms of what they would commit to. But by and large, everyone took their own pathways in terms of how they will respond to the Paris Agreement. Of course, we know that in the case of the U.S., the current administration had taken a position, and so far as I know, it hasn't changed in that they would renege on the Paris Agreement. But for any of the transitions to work, be it the energy transition of Australia or New Zealand or the United States or China, there has to be a global governance or a global collaboration. Because why? Again, all of these things are interconnected. So give you one very simple example. Rare earth metals, meaning lithium ion and all these other rare earth materials that are necessary for renewables. Well, if you design an energy transition pathway that is heavily linked to having these renewable energy resources, but there is a bottleneck in terms of having access to those raw materials, which are rare earth, which we know today for a fact majority are being mined or dominated from China, that could create all kinds of chokeholds in your ability to see your energy transition move forward. And so we have to understand that in terms of the pathways, there is an interdependency that I find, unfortunately, is being neglected by a lot of governments around the world who are singularly designing their pathways without thinking about the fact that their pathways have to function in the context of a global governance structure or some sort of a global collaboration. Without that, it's not going to happen. The next thing I think is important, that brings me to the other point here, which is commerce and finance. At the end of the day, someone has to pay for the energy transition pathway that any country chooses, right? Australia may choose a pathway that will fundamentally differ from that of New Zealand for local reasons based on the resources they have that's available. But however you cut it, there's the economics of the transition that has to be paid for. And the question is, who pays for it? And how do you communicate the need for it to be paid for? But more importantly, what is the benefit of the energy transition? So if you're asking people to make significant sacrifices, I understand the calculus of climate change. I understand the impact of climate change. But if I'm a poor villager living in, say, in Africa or in India or anywhere in the US for that matter, or even in Europe, where there's, in parts of Europe, significant energy poverty issues, if you're telling that person to not use fossil fuel, which it's the right thing to do, well, are they supposed to freeze in the middle of winter if they don't have access to electricity or some other form of energy? And so who pays for this is extremely important. The other point I think we sometimes overlook when it comes to the energy transition, and I will soon be wrapping up here to start with some questions, is the issue of the communications around the energy transition. What do I mean by that? We have seen in many countries where there's been attempts to do, say for example, cap and trade. I know in Australia you had your own experience with cap and trade or carbon tax. I mean, you've even lost governments. Prime ministers were kicked out of office because of their attempt to put one of those things in place. Well, there has to be a concerted effort on the part of all of us who believe in global energy transition, that the pathways have to be economically viable. It is not enough to line up very, very ambitious goals if we have not been able to get the public buy-in to pay for it. Because at the end of the day, as much as we believe and agree on the impacts of climate change, because it is almost, for some at least, perceived as a distant problem, getting people to commit resources, getting people to make the sacrifices to make it work is something that I think we need to spend more time doing. So what I always say when I talk about the local aspect of the energy transition pathway is that each of us on this call need to figure out a way to convince people in our networks about the value of making an investment in an energy transition and the sacrifices that we all have to make. And that is not an easy thing. Just give you an example, COVID-19. There have been plans by governments for the last 10 years telling them to prepare for the impact of global pandemic. But very few people heeded to that advice or those advice. And so how do you get people to then want to make commitments to investing huge amounts of money into something that perhaps may never come to fruition, but if it does, could have devastating consequences? That is why I always say that we should not only focus our effort on the technical aspects of this energy transition, but we should also design what I call communication strategy around energy pathways. And so once you've picked as a country a pathway that you think is technologically viable, you then need to say, okay, is it financially feasible? But then perhaps most important, is it politically and also socially acceptable? Because if that's not the case, you can put in place as many technical ideas around the use of renewables, the use of advanced nuclear fusion, hydrogen, you name it. At the end of the day, citizens in countries around the world have to be prepared to understand the consequences of doing nothing as it relates to climate and tying that back to health. My last comment I'll make, and then I'll be happy to take questions, Ariel, is the issue of digitalization and technology. Obviously, one of the things that have accelerated the use of renewables across the globe has been the significant advances that have been made in telecommunication systems, automatic control systems, and other kinds of advanced technology. We know today that sensors play a very important part in what it is that we're doing. So digitalization is key. But we also now are reaching the point where information, and that's the last point I have to make, information, data privacy, as well as cybersecurity is a critical aspect of the global energy system because of the interdependency and the coupling to digitalization. And so the key here is, as one country decides to design its energy transition pathway, because of the coupling to information technology, much time should be put into say, is this energy transition viable, not just from the standpoint of information technology being deployed, but also issues around data privacy, issues around governance, issues around what happens to the data. And so if you put this all in the broader context, going back to the slide when I talk about the emerging new normal, we have to, going forward, think of the energy transition of every country in a much more interdependent, holistic system where it's not just linked to the local issues of technology, innovation, global or local health or commerce. It has to be put in the context of the interdependency between the local energy transition pathway and the global system that surrounds it. So New Zealand, Australia may be far away, distant lands, islands, whatever, continents as well. But at the end of the day, they're part of an interconnected world. And so no local energy transition pathway is going to work completely by itself if it doesn't take into consideration some of the global interdependencies that I think are critical for us moving forward as part of the whole infrastructure build. So Ariel, I'll stop here and I'll be happy to take questions and respond as best as I can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lawrence. That was fantastic and really thought-provoking. We've discussed some of these things before, but every time I hear you speak, there's something else that comes up that I go, oh, okay, that's a good point. Didn't think of that. So I think that's, thank you very much for that. Might do the usual trick and maybe ask one question myself, and then we'll open to the audience. What we thought we'd do as a bit of an experiment is get people to put their hands up digitally and then enable them in a hopefully orderly fashion to turn on one at a time their audio, and they can ask the question. Is that okay with you, Lawrence?
Yeah, absolutely. Please go. I'm fine.
Yes. So we've already had one person put up their hand, so I'll ask them in a second. But I'll ask my first question then, and I guess I've got a few important questions that were big to me, but maybe one of the ones that might be also very interesting in the US context, given one of your previous presidential candidates was running on a platform of universal basic income and mitigating automation. And to me, automation is intimately tied in with energy. Like it's just the next step in the industrial revolution, where we take a little one person and put in a whole bunch of gigajoules and produce 100 persons worth of work. And now with automation, we're taking that a couple of levels of magnitude, orders of magnitude further. So how do you see this whole interaction between automation, universal basic income, and the fact is that, to those of us who think this is, a major issue like myself, we're going to see a lot of job losses anyway in that transition. So we've got multiple transitions happening. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Very, very good question, because a couple of months ago, I was fortunate to stumble upon a report that had been done as it relates to universal basic income based on some work that was done in Finland. But also some other countries have been exploring the idea of universal basic income. I think what's important and what COVID has shown us is that it is not enough to just give people basic income. I think there needs to be, I would take the conversation beyond basic income and talk about universal basic surviving kit or survival kit, because I can have a basic income, but if that basic income is so basic that I can still not survive, what's the point? I mean, you can give me $500, but if you have, whether it's inflation or other kinds of fiscal policies that make it difficult for me to live, I have an issue. So I think whilst in the universal basic income is a good idea, I think we need to be careful not to think that universal basic income will sort of eliminate poverty, because it depends on what basic is, right? And so so the key here is to define basic income as a dynamic concept as opposed to a static concept, because and that brings me back to this issue of healthcare, right? Or access to education, or access to food security, or access to rent. So I think automation plays a very important part in this context, because having access to broadband does not only give you information, it also helps you with e-health, right? So if you're in a village in say in sub-Saharan Africa, or even in parts of the US, for example, I give you a simple personal story. Over the last 5 months, if you're wondering why I perhaps look a little healthier now than you saw me the last time, Ariel, is because I now have a personal coach who I work with virtually, and it's actually covered by my insurance. So the issue here is automation, access to information is very important. And I think we need to couple it to universal basic income. It's not just the income that's important, it's the services. So it's almost like universal human services that are critical for society to move forward.
Right. Well, thank you, Lawrence. And I think we'll go to the audience now, and maybe we can sort of loop back to this a bit more later if there's time. I'm really keen to make sure this is as interactive as possible. So the first question was actually already raised a while ago now. So Chloe Monroe, and I'd also like to, before they thank the team who's put this together, 𝗻𝗫𝗗𝗏𝗏, sorry, I've got to pronounce that right, who's been the main force behind organizing these webinars, and of course 𝗗𝘁𝗀𝗁𝗏 𝗵𝗫, the GM of the Monash Energy Institute. There's a tremendous amount of work's gone into this behind the scenes, so thank you both, Nancy and 𝗗𝘁𝗀. So Chloe, go ahead with the question.
Well, thanks, Ariel, and thanks, Lawrence, for a great presentation. You have this wonderful way of tying all these different themes together. But it is a bit scary, because you're raising a lot of big open questions. And you raised the question about global governance and the idea that countries kind of decide the path they're on. Some of us feel as though we just stumble along by a kind of random process. But I wonder, with the influence of COVID, whether from what you're seeing and the people you're talking to around the world, are you feeling more optimistic that the world is capable of kind of governing these decisions in a helpful way? So I'd be interested in how you're feeling on that, and whether we're getting a bit more evidence-based. And if so, what's the evidence that you're drawing on from your experience that's leading you to that optimism, or alternatively pessimism?
Thanks, Chloe. And again, it's kind of funny that this conversation I'm having now, because one of my last interesting conversations in Australia was a long walk with Chloe, where we covered a whole ground, a lot of those topics on that Saturday afternoon. I still remember. I think I'm a little bit more optimistic, and this is the basis for my optimism. I think there is a recognition that whilst there may be political, ambitions from different leaders to sort of take advantage of this pandemic one way or another, I think under the table, or you may there are a lot of undercurrents of urging this need for collaboration, right? And so what you may see sometimes from a national perspective in some countries does not reflect what's happening at the grassroots level. I know, for example, if you take the situation in Europe, whilst the European Union have been taking some very bullish move when it comes to, say, issues around COVID, but also just the whole energy transition. I think industries are finding it very important for them to come together. You have conversations around things like the circular economy, which is now drawing support from so many different places. I think the other thing is that gives me hope is that money talks. By money talks, I mean, Chloe, that a lot of the large investment banks and large investors are recognizing that the viability of their long-term assets hinges on there being some form of global stability, global structure, understanding the issue of globalization in a much more different way. I was fortunate to have to interview Dr. 𝗗𝘁𝗁𝗲𝗱, who's one of the world's leading public policy thinker in terms of globalization, based on his new book about the world. And one of the things he made clear is that we need to do a better job in educating everyone, and not just politicians, but everyone, about the importance and the value of globalization. So I think there are undercurrents that are leading us to being a much more homogeneous world working together. I'm part of this group that has started this thing called Question Storming, where we bring together 12 individuals from around the world on a session, and we've had several of these sessions to talk about the topic of how do you rebuild trust in a broken world. And it's amazing to see the level of interest in that question, because I think everyone recognizes that we cannot move forward as a global community if we remain sort of on our respective islands. The question is, what happens from a political standpoint in terms of citizens recognizing that it is in our best interest as global citizens to find a way to work together. So people I'm talking to, investors and others, are leaning towards having much more collaboration, because like I said, it is no interest for an airline if I cannot travel to Melbourne. So if you think about it, there are a lot of losers if this global governance doesn't come into play. All right, and I think that's what you're going to see happening, is just the mere demand for us to work together as a global community. That gives me hope.
Thank you. So I think, if there's a little follow-up kind of clarification from a person who's asking a question like Chloe, I think it's useful to put that in. Anything there from you, Chloe? Are you happy with that? I guess.
No, I thought that was great, and I think you're right. I mean, it is at the moment. It certainly seems from here that a lot of the pressure is investor-led, and there's, in a way, there's remarkable ebullience on the investment side of things in the face of what's happening with COVID. So you can only assume they can see ways of resolving some of the issues exactly as you're talking about. You actually have to have, both ends of the supply chain for things to work. And so I find that that's a very encouraging perspective that you've just raised, Lauren.
Right. Well, thank you, Chloe. A great question, and I wish we had more time to kind of roll through the consequences, implications of that. So the next question is from David Prinz. And so David, go ahead.
Thanks, Ariel. I've unmuted. Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you, Lawrence. That's a great presentation. Moving sort of what you were talking about just now about global collaboration, I think in the short term, what we're seeing is actually moving away from global collaboration. We've got closing of physical borders. We've got governments looking after citizens economically, but leaving the visa holders stranded. We're seeing that particularly in Australia. We're going to see a lot less migration. Therefore, we're going to see labour issues from countries like Australia that rely on migrants. As you said, the airlines with reduced travel. So I think we need something to move us from this very short-term way of looking at things to the more long-term view of global collaboration that you're talking about. And I'm thinking about that big diagram you put up with the cogs and the big wheels, and I'm thinking, where does everything else fit? And AI must be a part of that, because that's sort of the non-physical contacts. Are we remaking a world with a new economy where humans look after things but don't need to physically connect by being, within 1.5 meters of each other? if you know what I mean, by as much as they used to. But relying on the communications, relying on the energy, relying on the AI, and relying on everything else to basically get us back on our feet again, because the world's in a mess and we need to sort out the health and the economy and the information flows and everything else.
Yeah, you know, you bring up a valid point. I appreciate the introduction of AI in this conversation. I didn't want to do it because I'm partial to AI in the fact that I spend a lot of time also thinking about it. I've had conversations with Ariel as well. The point I'll make here, David, which I think is important, is that we have to also rethink work. You know, you talk about the role of migrant workers, you talk about the role of just unemployment being so high. I mean, the reality is sometimes we need to ask ourselves the hard question. Yes, one hard question. Again, I'm not taking position for it. It's just a hard question, right? Urbanization as we know it, does it make sense? Right? Now, if you are an economist, you will tell me that economies of scale is the best way to drive an economy. Fine. But human behavior may not necessarily lend itself to the world post-COVID-19, because if more and more people are reluctant to live in large urban communities, who is going to want to invest in real estate and who is going to want to work in those cities, right? So I think part of the rethink we have here, and you raise a very important point, long-term. The question is, I'm in pain right now. Don't tell me about long-term. So the political work that needs to be done here is also one where we have to almost evangelize the world about the new order in terms of the value system, the norms, so that it's okay to work from home 75% of the time if all I do when I come to the office is to sit behind my desk and talk to one person the entire day. Now, think about how much effort it has to put me through to get up in the morning, if I'm living in Tokyo, for example, commute into Tokyo for an hour and 15 minutes, sit behind my desk, don't speak to anybody, get back on a train for another hour and 15 minutes, and go back to my house. Now, does that make practical sense? And the challenge we have is we've made so much investment in urban infrastructure. If we now see exodus from the urban community, what happens then? So these are very, very hard questions that you kind of bring up when you talk about the role of AI. And AI plays an important role, but I think the bigger question for us is, how do we start having these conversations to say, you know what? It is okay if 40% of my workforce never comes into the office physically. Because if you think about it, it didn't make sense in the first place when they did it pre-COVID, but it was just because that's what we did. And so the challenge is, how do we agree that it is okay for people to not have to commute 2 hours a day, both directions to go to work? It makes no sense, but we've done it, and that's what we've done. And so the real challenge is, how do we ask the hard questions to begin to rethink some of the things you've raised?
Great. Well, thank you, Lawrence, and thank you, David, for the question. I wish we had more time to discuss these sort of things in detail. We've got 4 minutes now, and so I'll get 𝗗𝘁𝗲𝗿. Nancy, can you unmute 𝗗𝘗𝗿? We've got time for 2 questions, but the questions and the answers have to be very quick. So go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Ariel, and thank you, Dr. Lawrence Jones, for the insightful talk. I'm 𝗗𝘗𝗿, and my question is about the fairness in the process of energy transition, so making our system more sustainable and clean. But in the past, there are many different energy programs providing kind of subsidy to users and for them to install different technologies like PV panels, storage, or improve their energy efficiency. But some research, for example, in California, they showed a significant imbalance in those programs, saying the participation ratio of those vulnerable groups like income and disabled person, that the ratio is much lower than that of other groups. And maybe the COVID-19 pandemic and also the impact on the economy may make the situation even worse. So can you share your thoughts on this issue and how to make sure that everyone could benefit from this energy transition? Thank you.
I'll be brief because I'm sure I want to take one or two more questions. All I will say to you is the following, right? So the issue of just and equitable transition is one that we must tackle. And what I would say as it relates to technology choice being selected by governments in terms of subsidies here and there, right? I always use Denmark as an example. It's very easy to put in subsidies. It's very difficult to take it away. The only exception I see is what the Danes did. Part of the challenge is for it to be equitable, you have to design the system not thinking about who benefits the most, but you say who has most to lose. And in many of these systems, like in the case of California, the rich are the ones who have the solar rooftop. But for them to have their solar rooftop, there has to be an investment in the grid. And to invest in the grid, the cost of the grid may have to go up. When that cost goes up, guess who suffers the most? The underprivileged. So I think the real challenge you raise here, How, is that how you design these policies must begin by not asking who benefits the most, but it should be who loses the most in the long term, because this is what always happens. It's easy to talk about benefits, but who's the loser here? And in this case, when it comes to renewables and energy transition, a lot of the conversation is around, who benefits. But I think we should start asking the question, who's actually the loser here? Because if you identify the loser, you might design a much better system than if you just think about who are the winners.
Great, thank you, Lawrence. There's a sort of an emerging theme here as well that I'll see if I can fit in another question. We'll go a little bit over time, maybe but I'd like to get a couple of other questions in. We have a couple that came through the chat, so I might just jump through them rather than, in the interest of time, taking it audio. Angus Howden asks, how much of a role do you see hydrogen playing in the transition?
Hydrogen is going to play a significant role depending on, be local. Obviously, Europe is going to have is placing a major bet on hydrogen. Obviously, in Australia, you guys are doing it as well. But I think Europe, Japan, Australia, places where you should watch with regards to hydrogen. In the US, there is now, surprisingly, an uptick in interest in hydrogen by a lot of energy companies. And so I think hydrogen will play a role. The question is, there are issues around, safety and some of the infrastructure that needs to be built. Will it dominate the energy transition? I don't think so, but it's going to certainly be one of the players to watch.
Right. So I have a question about a follow-up, like very quick answer from you maybe on the hydrogen thing is, how do we know that this whole hydrogen thing doesn't, it has a lot of hope and technologically it seems sound. How do we make sure it doesn't end up like CCS? We had a lot of hope in that in the past. And so what's the difference? Like, why is this going to work this time?
Well, first of all, I will push back a little bit, Ariel, and say that we have not given up hope on CCS. I think CCUS is there's still a chance for that. And for the very same reason, it's the issue of, if we could come together as a global community and say, let's invest in hydrogen and create a much bigger pot. The challenge is few nations want to dominate, right? And because you have that, it's not scaling up fast enough. If I were some sort of a global czar when it comes to the energy transition, I will create a sort of a global framework where people will invest as a global community. So instead of just having Australia, Australia, Japan, and the EU investing in hydrogen, I would say, like, all the major economies create a hydrogen fund, create a CCUS fund, and let's scale this up. The challenge is competitive forces, right? So if you want to invest in hydrogen, I want to be the beneficiary. And so that creates a lot of problems. But I think it's not, I think technology is faster. We have the technology, we have the ability to move forward. The issue is policy and politics.
Right, good point. And so I won't give up hope on either, maybe. Well, I have a lot of hope for hydrogen. I have a lot of hope for hydrogen.
You should never give up hope on anything. As long as you're alive, there's hope.
That's true. All right, so we have one more question then, and
sure.
then people already have to go. Diane Krall, who's at Monash University, one of my colleagues in business and economics, is asking, you talked about the international trade and energy being sort of impacted significantly under the transition. But how do you see, do you have any comments on the global export of renewable energy, e.g. Australia's plans to lay deep sea cables and export renewable generated energy to, say, Indonesia, Southeast Asia? how will that play out? Is that kind of a new international energy trade? That was also my thought.
Yeah, so I think the key with that is who owns the infrastructure, right? I mean, the resource is already there. I mean, the wind is blowing, the sun is shining. The issue is how do you scale it up? And to the extent that Australia wants to partner with other countries, I think the key for these international energy flows to work, there has to be partnership. If one country wants to dominate the scene, that's not going to happen because there has to be cross benefits for every country. So I see Diane, she's unmuted, but my comment to her would be that we need to think about how say, for example, Australia, New Zealand could form a pact to invest in a undersea cable that will be beneficial to both countries. But what I see happening is that every country wants to do it by themselves, right? And, I want a cable from New Zealand should be owned by New Zealand. There needs to be greater collaboration for these large energy systems to work and to make sense.
Diane, did you have any sort of follow-up thoughts briefly?
I guess I'm just concerned about, is there an environmental issue with these ideas to lay deep sea cables? I mean, we're worried about the Great Barrier Reef, for instance.
Oh, so you raise a very important point. So I hadn't thought of the environmental aspect of your question. I was thinking more about just the sort of the political, geopolitical aspect of it. But you're absolutely right that we need to think about the environmental impacts of any sort of infrastructure that's been put in place. I remember many years ago when HVDC cables were being put in place, there were a lot of concerns, especially in Scandinavia, because I know that because at the time I was doing some work for ABB, there were a lot of concerns about the fact that the high voltage cable would send out some sort of signals that will affect some of the undersea life in terms of fish and other types of things. And so that forced the suppliers to come up with a scheme to sort of reduce some of the sort of potential impacts those cables will have. And one solution was to lay the cables a little deeper, but also to kind of put them into some sort of a conduit, right? So I think you're absolutely right, Diane, that yes, we need to think about when you're laying these kinds of cables, what are the long-term implications when it comes to sea life, and how do you make sure that you do it in a way that doesn't affect them? And there needs to be transparency. I completely agree with you that there needs to be transparency in how these cables are being laid. What concerns me the most actually when it comes to these is what's happening, say, around in sub-Saharan Africa, where a lot of these technology are being deployed, but many African countries lack the ability to do the kind of research to push back and make sure that they've been done in an environmentally friendly way. So you're absolutely right. That's something I hadn't thought about, and that is the environmental implications of the energy transition. Because one last point I will make, Ariel, which I know is a bit thought-provoking and people may not like to hear, but I've always asked the question, is renewable, as much as we like it, is renewables being produced, or are renewables being produced in an environmentally friendly way? And every time I bring up this question, people will tell me, well, Lawrence, the carbon footprint of a wind turbine is not as bad as the carbon footprint of something else. But no one has ever shown me the fact that most wind turbines, if they're manufactured in certain countries, may be manufactured using high fossil intensive energy sources. So we need to just come clean and say, you know what? Every resource in today's world has a carbon footprint that we need to analyze and to be candid about in terms of saying it's renewable, but to produce it, we've used unrenewable resource. So maybe I'll end there by saying producing renewable using unrenewable resources is not perhaps the most sustainable way to produce renewable resources.
Thank you, Lawrence. I think that's a very thought-provoking question, and we could spend another hour discussing exactly what that means. I did have a final question, if you could ask me, and then we can wrap up. I think people need to go. You made this point, and about like the cost of any investments in the renewable transition, and then basically you have to some kind of direct or indirect subsidy is required. And what always challenges me on these sort of questions when people talk about them is particularly when they talk about a carbon tax, right? And it sounds like, oh, there's this just sort of magic impost on the economy. There's just money that just exits the economy and disappears. well, that's not actually true. It's just, isn't it a wealth transfer? You know, you're moving money from one part of the economy to the other. I mean, you're creating different jobs. So it's not like you just, you know, this whole argument that people make, oh, you know, the carbon price is just going to be put the brakes on the economy. That's not very precise. So how do we, you know, address that? How do we answer that one? How do you think about it?
So one of the things I recall many years ago in the context of, that was before I worked at EI, I was working for a technology company at the time. And I remember a discussion I participated in around carbon tax or, you know, or cap and trade and all these different schemes, right? I think fundamentally what the issue is that we have to find a way as society to say, where do we find a degree of shared value in terms of saying, and this is one of the challenges we face in a world where whenever it comes to subsidies, people will say, in one context, if I subsidize something that say benefits one part of the society, I call it a different name. I don't call it a subsidy. I may call it a tax break, or I may call it something else. Whereas if I do something to help the poor, I call it welfare, right? And so the challenge is, you're right, Ariel, is one cake, and we just shift the different piece of the cake to different people, right? And the question is, who gets the bigger piece of the cake or the pie? Is the one who screamed the loudest, or who has the strength to scream the loudest? So I think the best solution, or the best one solution to this problem, is to participate in these kinds of question storming sessions I have been running, where I'm actually forcing people to say, okay, you want us to have a just and reasonable society, but what are you prepared to do? You know, I gave a talk a couple of months ago. I did an interview on a TV station here in the States where we're talking about millennials, and they were talking about, you know, this Swedish lady who's been involved in all the campaigning, the young lady, very, very nice. And, you know, having lived in Sweden, I think what she's doing is certainly admirable. But I said, if I'm a young person in Africa who's living in poverty, and you're telling me in Sweden, a young person is telling me I should do more for the planet, well, it's kind of hard because I'm already poor. Whereas a poor person in Sweden is not as poor as a poor person in, say, in Africa. So I asked the question, what are the millennials in Australia, in New Zealand, in Sweden, prepared to do, to give up, to sacrifice, so that their cohorts, other millennials in poorer countries, can see their standard of living go up? And, you know, Greta Thunberg and all those people, they're doing a good job. I like what she's doing. But my question is, Greta, are you prepared to sacrifice something so that the poor kids in Africa and Australia and elsewhere themselves can raise their standard of living? So shared sacrifice, I'm sorry to say, Ariel, is the only way we can deal with this issue of inequity when it comes to the energy transition. It is not enough to say we should ban all the coal plants, because in India, for example, they have 600 million people who lack access to electricity. What are they going to do if they stop using coal? Well, one thing they could do is that if those young people, say in Sweden and Germany and Australia, would agree to take even 1/10 of their pocket change, if you want to call it that, and invest in a fund to bring renewables to those countries, then you will start to see the culture of a shared value. But right now, everybody's in it for themselves. So I always tell my friends who are advocating for change, you have to be, like Gandhi said, you have to be the change that you want to see happening around the world. So that's what I will say, Ariel.
Awesome. Thank you, Lawrence. I think that's a very good point at which to end the webinar. I'll just add that I think this is the crux of the issue, and what creates challenges in the UN negotiations is it, you know, and we need to separate out this question, you know, this inside the developed economy, the cross subsidies or whatever, versus the really big issue is, like, you know, the wealth disparity between, you know, Africa and Europe, and how do we actually ensure that these things happen equitably. And so Yes, I think that's might be a good focus area for the next webinar from you, Lawrence, because I think that's one of the fundamental areas. So anyway, I would like to now formally close the webinar. I'd like to again thank Dr. Lawrence Jones for a fantastic and thought-provoking presentation. And thank you, Nancy, and for organising the webinar so effectively, and behind the scenes coordinating, turning people's audio back on and off and all that. 𝗗𝘁𝗁𝗲 for helping coordinate all the activities across the Institute. And just wanted to remind you that the webinar is recorded and will be available on our website. And also, if you have any more questions, you can contact us on the Monash Energy Institute email, and we can forward them on to Lawrence if we can't answer them ourselves, which I'm sure we get a lot of those. And yeah, thanks very much. And thank you, Lawrence. And we'll see you next time, and hopefully back here in Australia in less than a year. Oh my goodness, yes.
Thank you so much. Be safe. And again, it's a pleasure.
All right, thank you very much. And thank you for the audience for your time and for staying a bit longer than the original time. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.